The billionaire had fired 11 nannies in less than a year. But that morning, when Celesty Monroe stepped through the enormous golden gates of the Sinclair estate, she had no idea that she was about to become the 12th woman to walk into a house where no nanny had ever lasted long. And she certainly didn't know that 3 stubborn children were already waiting for her, waiting to break her, waiting to make her quit, and waiting to ask her for the one thing every nanny before her had refused to do: dance. The Sinclair mansion stood on a hill overlooking the city, surrounded by perfectly trimmed gardens, tall iron gates, and security cameras positioned at almost every corner. It was beautiful. It was enormous. And according to the stories Celesty had heard, it was also one of the most difficult places in the city to work. The owner, Everett Sinclair, was a billionaire known for his strict nature and private lifestyle. But his 3 children were even more famous. The triplets, Julian, Elias, and Rosalie, 7 years old. 3 identical birthdays, 3 completely different personalities, and 1 shared talent: making nannies quit. Celesty had heard the stories during her interview. One nanny had lasted 4 days. Another had lasted 9. One had walked out crying after the children filled her bedroom with dozens of balloons at midnight. Another had discovered that her shoes had been glued to the floor. One woman had even found her purse hanging from a tree outside the mansion. The children had apparently laughed for nearly an hour. But the strangest part wasn't their pranks. It was what they asked every nanny to do: dance. Every single nanny. And every single nanny had refused. Celesty had been told that the children would eventually ask her the same question. She had simply smiled. Children are children, she had thought. She had no idea how wrong she was. When Celesty arrived at the mansion, a woman named Mrs. Harlow, the head housekeeper, met her at the entrance. The older woman looked Celesty up and down. "You understand what you're walking into?" she asked. Celesty smiled politely. "I was told the children are difficult." Mrs. Harlow gave a short laugh. "Difficult?" She shook her head. "That's a gentle word." Celeste's smile faded slightly. Mrs. Harlow leaned closer. "Don't take their behavior personally. And whatever you do—" She paused. "Don't let them make you angry." "Why?" "Because that's what they want." Before Celesty could respond, something crashed upstairs. Crash. Mrs. Harlow closed her eyes. Celesty looked toward the ceiling. What was that? "Your first warning." Another crash followed. Then a child's laughter. Mrs. Harlow sighed. "They know you're here." Celesty walked upstairs. The hallway was beautiful, with expensive paintings hanging on the walls and a long staircase leading to the children's rooms. She reached the end of the hallway. 3 bedroom doors stood open. She stepped inside. Nobody was there. She frowned. "Hello." Silence. Then suddenly, splash. A bucket of water fell from above. Celesty jumped backward. The water missed her by inches and crashed onto the floor. She stared at the puddle. Then she heard laughter. She slowly looked toward the top of the staircase. 3 little faces were peeking over the railing. Julian, Elias, Rosalie. They looked at her. She looked at them. Nobody spoke. Then Rosalie whispered loudly enough for her brothers to hear. She didn't scream. Julian frowned. Maybe she didn't get wet enough. Elias nodded seriously. "We need another one." The 3 disappeared. Celesty sighed. She picked up the bucket. Interesting. For the next several days, the triplets tested her. They hid her phone. They switched the labels on the children's clothes. They poured cereal into her work shoes. They told her the family dog was missing when the dog was actually sleeping under the dining table. They complained about every meal. They refused to sleep. They argued over everything. And whenever Celesty corrected them, they would look at one another and smile. They were waiting for her to lose patience. But Celesty didn't. When they hid her phone, she found it. When they messed up the clothes, she calmly fixed them. When they refused to eat, she didn't scream. She simply sat at the table and waited. One afternoon, Julian looked at her suspiciously. "You're still here." Celesty looked at him. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I'm working." Elias crossed his arms. "We made other nannies leave. I heard. You're supposed to leave too." Celesty smiled. "Then you'll have to try harder." The 3 children stared at her. For the first time, they didn't laugh. They looked almost impressed. But Celesty noticed something else. Behind all their stubbornness was sadness. Sometimes, when they thought nobody was watching, the triplets would sit together near the window. They would look at an old photograph on the mantelpiece. Their mother, Vivian Sinclair. She had died several years earlier. Nobody talked about her much, especially not Everett. But Celesty could see the effect her absence had on the children. They weren't simply naughty. They were hurting. And perhaps that was why they fought so hard against every nanny. Perhaps they didn't want another woman entering their lives. Perhaps they were afraid that if they became attached to someone, that person would disappear too. Celesty didn't know. But she decided not to force them. She would simply stay. On the 6th afternoon, something unusual happened. The children were sitting in the living room when Julian suddenly looked at Celesty. He smiled. It wasn't his usual mischievous smile. It was almost innocent. Celesty. Yes. Do you know how to dance? Celesty laughed softly. A little. The three children looked at each other. Then Elias grinned. Show us. Celesty immediately understood. This was the famous question. The question every nanny had been asked. She remembered Mrs. Harlow's warning. She also remembered the stories. The children wanted to make her look foolish. Probably laugh at her. Maybe record her. Celesty folded her arms. You want me to dance? All three nodded. Yes. Why? Rosalie smiled. Just dance. Celesty studied their faces. Then she sighed. Fine. The children's eyes widened. They hadn't expected her to agree. Julian quickly grabbed the remote. Elias ran to the speaker. Rosalie jumped onto the sofa. Music filled the room. Celesty stood in the middle. For a moment, she simply stared at them. Then she started moving. Slowly at first. Then faster. She twisted her shoulders. Spun around. Moved her feet dramatically. Then suddenly made an exaggerated face and started dancing so wildly that even she almost lost her balance. The children stared. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Then, Rosalie burst out laughing. Julian followed. Elias fell backward onto the sofa, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. Celesty stopped. She stared at them. Their laughter filled the room. Not mocking laughter. Not mischievous laughter. Real laughter. Pure laughter. The kind she hadn't heard from them since she arrived. Celesty smiled. Then Julian suddenly shouted through his laughter. She dances like Mommy. Celesty froze. Elias immediately sat up. She really does. Rosalie pointed at Celesty. Yes, she dances exactly like Mommy. All three children shouted together. Mommy. Celeste's smile slowly disappeared. She looked at them. Then at the photograph of Vivian, sitting on the mantel. Her heart began beating strangely. She looked back at the children. Is that really so? She didn't say the words aloud, but the thought had already entered her mind. How could she possibly dance like their mother? Celesty had never met Vivian. She knew nothing about her. At least, that's what she believed. And for the first time since she arrived at the Sinclair mansion, Celesty wondered whether there was something about this family that she hadn't been told. Something hidden. Something important. Then the music suddenly stopped. The children weren't laughing anymore. They were staring toward the doorway. Celesty turned, and her heart nearly stopped. Everett Sinclair was standing there. He had returned home, without warning. His eyes weren't on the children. They were fixed entirely on Celesty. More specifically, on the way she had been dancing. His face had gone completely pale. He whispered a single word. Vivian. Celesty stared at him, and in that moment, she realized something terrifying. Everett wasn't simply surprised. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. For several seconds, nobody moved. The music had stopped. The triplets were silent. Celesty stood in the middle of the room, still trying to understand the billionaire's reaction. But Everett Sinclair wasn't looking at the children. He was staring at her. His face had lost all its color. His eyes were fixed on Celesty as though he had been transported somewhere else entirely. Then, almost under his breath, he said it again. Vivian. Celesty swallowed. Sir. Everett blinked. He seemed to realize where he was. He straightened himself immediately, trying to hide whatever had just happened. Who taught you that dance? Celesty frowned. I don't know, sir. You don't know. I mean, nobody taught me. I was just dancing. Everett stared at her. That isn't what I asked. Celesty didn't understand. I've never seen your wife dance, sir. The room became completely silent. Everett's expression changed. How did you know I was talking about my wife? Celesty froze. She hadn't even realized what she'd said. I saw her photograph. Everett slowly turned toward the portrait on the mantel. Vivian, his late wife. A beautiful woman with warm eyes and an unmistakable smile. He looked back at Celesty. You've never met her? No. Then why do you dance like her? Celesty had no answer, and neither did Everett. Before either of them could say another word, Rosalie suddenly grabbed Celeste's hand. Daddy, don't make her leave. Everett looked down at his daughter. I'm not making anyone leave. You were looking at her like you were angry. I wasn't angry. You were. Julian stepped forward. Daddy, she made us laugh. Elias nodded. Like Mommy used to. Everett's jaw tightened. Enough. The children immediately became quiet. Celesty watched him carefully. She could see the pain in his eyes. This wasn't anger. It was grief. Everett looked at the children. Go upstairs. But, now, the triplets slowly walked away. But before Rosalie disappeared around the corner, she looked back at Celesty. There was something in her expression. Something almost like fear. Celesty noticed, and it bothered her. When the children were gone, Everett remained standing in the living room. Celesty. Yes, sir. I want you to tell me everything about yourself. She was confused. Myself. Where you grew up. Your family. Your previous employers. Everything. Celesty hesitated. She had already provided all of that during the interview, but something about his tone made her uncomfortable. She answered anyway. I grew up with my grandmother. My parents died when I was young. I've worked with children for several years. I've never worked for anyone in your family before. Everett watched her closely. Are you sure? Yes. Have you ever seen my wife before? No. Have you ever heard her voice? No. Have you ever been inside this house before? Celesty shook her head. Never. Everett said nothing. He walked toward the mantel and picked up Vivian's photograph. For a moment, he stared at it. Then he looked back at Celesty. My wife used to dance exactly like that. Celesty felt a strange chill. What do you mean? She would do that ridiculous little spin whenever the children were upset. He smiled faintly. It was the first time Celesty had seen him smile. She'd make those exaggerated faces too. Celesty looked at the children, who had disappeared upstairs. So that's why they laughed. Everett nodded. They haven't laughed like that in years. His voice became quieter. Not since she died. That evening, something changed. The triplets no longer tried to make Celesty miserable. They followed her around. When she prepared dinner, they sat nearby. When she folded their clothes, they helped. When she told them it was bedtime, they didn't argue. Celesty couldn't believe it. Mrs. Harlow noticed too. She watched Julian carry Celeste's slippers across the hallway. Then she looked at Celesty. What did you do to them? Celesty laughed. Nothing. Mrs. Harlow shook her head. They've never behaved like this. Celesty glanced toward the children's bedroom. They just needed someone to laugh with. Mrs. Harlow's expression suddenly became serious. You remind them of their mother. Celesty looked at her. So everyone keeps telling me. Mrs. Harlow hesitated. There's a reason that matters. What reason? The older woman looked toward the staircase, then lowered her voice. Vivian was the only person who could control those children. Celesty smiled. I wouldn't say I'm controlling them. You don't understand. Mrs. Harlow stepped closer. After Vivian died, those children changed. Celesty listened carefully. They stopped laughing. They stopped trusting people. Every nanny who came here reminded them that their mother was gone. That's why they drove them away. Mrs. Harlow nodded. They wanted every woman to leave. Celeste's heart softened. So the dancing was their test. Celesty frowned. Their test. Every nanny refused to dance. The children would laugh at them and make things worse. Celesty suddenly understood. They weren't trying to mock the nannies. No. Mrs. Harlow looked toward the photograph of Vivian. They were looking for their mother. That night, Celesty couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what Julian had said. She dances like Mommy. She turned over in bed. There had to be an explanation. Maybe she had simply danced in a similar way. Maybe it was coincidence. But why had Everett reacted so strongly? And why had Mrs. Harlow said there was a reason it mattered? Celesty finally got out of bed. She walked into the hallway. The mansion was silent. She went downstairs for some water. As she passed the living room, she noticed something. The portrait of Vivian was still there. Celesty stopped. She walked closer. There was something strange about the photograph. Vivian wasn't standing normally. She was posing with one foot slightly raised. Her hand was positioned near her shoulder. Her head tilted slightly to one side. Celesty stared. Something about the pose felt familiar. Very familiar. She suddenly remembered something from her childhood. A woman. A song. A dance. A warm voice laughing. Celeste's heart began pounding. She closed her eyes. For just a moment, she saw a memory. A little girl, running through a small house. A woman dancing in the kitchen. And that same ridiculous spin. Celesty opened her eyes. She stepped backward. No, it couldn't be. She had been too young. Her memories were incomplete. And the woman in her memory. She couldn't remember her face. A floorboard creaked behind her. Celesty spun around. Nobody was there. She looked toward the staircase. Then she heard a small voice. Celesty. She turned. Rosalie was standing there in her pajamas. Why are you awake? Rosalie didn't answer. Instead, she walked toward the portrait. Then she looked at Celesty. Mommy used to say something. What? Rosalie whispered. If something ever happens to me, don't trust everyone who says they loved me. Celeste's blood ran cold. Who told you that? Mommy. Rosalie, when did she say that? The little girl looked frightened. Before she died. Celesty knelt down. What did she mean? Rosalie looked toward the staircase. Then she whispered, Daddy doesn't know. Before Celesty could ask another question, footsteps sounded from upstairs. Rosalie immediately ran away. Celesty stood frozen. Then she heard Everett's voice. Celesty. She turned. Everett was standing at the top of the staircase. His expression was unreadable. What are you doing down here? Celesty opened her mouth. But before she could answer, Everett's eyes moved toward the portrait, then back to her. And suddenly, his face changed. He looked frightened, not because Celesty was standing there, but because he had noticed something behind her. Celesty slowly turned around. On the floor beneath the portrait was a small wooden box. It hadn't been there earlier. Everett walked downstairs quickly. Don't touch that. Celesty stopped. What is it? Everett stared at the box. I don't know. But his voice said otherwise. He clearly did. Celesty looked at him. Sir. Everett interrupted her. Go to your room. But, now. Celesty reluctantly walked away. But as she climbed the stairs, she looked back. Everett remained beside the box. He slowly knelt down. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was an old photograph. Everett pulled it out. His eyes widened, because the photograph showed Vivian standing beside another woman, a much younger woman, and that woman looked remarkably like Celesty. Everett stared at the photograph in disbelief. Then he whispered, Who are you? Upstairs. Celesty stopped walking. She had heard him, and for the first time, she began to wonder whether her arrival at the Sinclair mansion had truly been an accident. Celesty barely slept that night. The image of the photograph kept returning to her mind. The woman standing beside Vivian looked like her. Not exactly, but enough to make her uncomfortable. The same eyes, the same shape of the face, the same small smile. And Everett's reaction had been even more disturbing. He had looked at the photograph as though he had just discovered something he had spent years trying to forget. By morning, Celesty had made up her mind. She was going to ask him about it. But when she entered the kitchen, Everett was already there. He looked exhausted. The photograph was nowhere to be seen. Good morning, sir. Good morning. Celesty waited. Everett continued drinking his coffee. Finally, she said, About last night. I don't want to discuss it. Celesty frowned. But you asked me questions about my family yesterday. I know. And then you found that photograph. Everett put down his cup. Celesty, there are things about my wife's past that I don't understand myself. Then why did you look at me like you knew me? He stared at her. I didn't. You did. Silence. Everett finally stood. Please trust me when I say this. Some things are better left alone. Celesty looked at him. Maybe for you. She turned and walked away. But she didn't notice the triplets standing at the doorway. They had heard everything. Later that morning, Julian, Elias, and Rosalie behaved differently. They were unusually quiet. Celesty noticed immediately. What's wrong? Nobody answered. She sat beside them. Did something happen? Rosalie looked at her. Daddy was looking at Mommy's old things last night. Celesty's heart skipped. Where? In his office. Why? Julian whispered. Because of you. Celesty stared at him. Because of me? Elias nodded. He thinks you know something. Celesty felt a chill. I don't know anything. Rosalie suddenly reached into her pocket. She pulled out a tiny silver key. Celesty looked at it. What's that? Mommy gave it to me. When? Before she died. Celesty's eyes widened. Why didn't you tell your father? Rosalie shook her head. Mommy told me never to give it to Daddy unless I knew he was ready. Celesty stared at the key. What does it open? Rosalie pointed toward the hallway. Mommy's room. Vivian's room had been locked since her death. Nobody was allowed inside. Not even the children. Everett had kept it exactly as she left it. Celesty followed the children down the hallway. They stopped in front of a large wooden door. Rosalie held out the key. You do it. Celesty hesitated. She looked at the three children, then inserted the key. Click. The door opened. A cold silence seemed to pour from the room. Everything inside looked untouched. Her perfume bottle, her books, her jewelry box, her photographs, even a scarf hanging over a chair. Celesty stepped inside. Something about the room felt strangely familiar. She walked toward the dressing table. Then she saw it. A photograph. The same woman from the photograph Everett had discovered. But this time, Celesty could see her clearly. She picked it up. Her hands began shaking. The woman was standing beside Vivian, and on the back of the photograph was a handwritten message. Celesty read it. To my sister, Nadia. No matter what happens, protect my children. Celesty stopped breathing. Her sister, Nadia. She stared at the woman, then at her own reflection in the mirror. Her heart pounded. No, she whispered. She suddenly remembered her grandmother telling her something when she was a child. Your mother had a sister. Celesty had always assumed it was a distant relative. She had never known her name. She had never seen her face. Until now. Nadia was her mother, and Vivian had been her aunt. Celesty stumbled backward. The children stared at her. Rosalie asked softly, Are you okay? Celesty couldn't answer. But they weren't alone. Someone was standing outside the room, watching, listening. And when that person heard Celesty say the word sister, they quietly walked away. Downstairs, Everett was in his office. He had spent the entire morning searching through old files. There was one question he couldn't escape. Why had Vivian never told him about Nadia? Why had she kept her sister's existence secret? And why did Celesty look so much like her? A knock came at the door. Mrs. Harlow entered. Sir. Everett looked up. I found something. What? Mrs. Harlow placed an old envelope on his desk. It belonged to Vivian. Everett opened it. Inside was a letter. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. The first line made his heart stop. Everett, if you are reading this, something has happened to me. He continued reading. Vivian explained that she had been afraid. Someone close to the family had been threatening her. She had discovered that money was being secretly transferred from Everett's accounts. She had confronted the person responsible, and after that confrontation, she had begun receiving threats. Then came the sentence that terrified Everett most. If anything happens to me, find my sister Nadia. She has the proof. Everett's eyes widened. Nadia. Then he heard footsteps. He looked toward the door. Celesty was standing there. She had tears in her eyes. Everett slowly stood. You know. Celesty nodded. I think I finally understand. She placed the photograph on his desk. My mother was Nadia. Everett stared at her. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Then he whispered, Your mother. He looked at the photograph. Then at Celesty. Vivian spent years trying to find her. Celesty shook her head. My mother died when I was little. Everett's face fell. I didn't know. You didn't know she existed? No. Celesty's voice broke. Then why did your wife know me? Everett looked at the letter again, and suddenly, something clicked. Vivian hadn't been trying to find Nadia for herself. She had been trying to protect Nadia's daughter, Celesty. Before Everett could explain, the sound of children screaming came from upstairs. Both of them froze. Daddy! Everett ran. Celesty followed. They reached the hallway. The triplets were standing outside Vivian's room. Rosalie was crying. What happened? She pointed inside. Someone was in Mommy's room. Everett's face hardened. What? Julian pointed toward the window. We heard the door. Elias added. Then someone ran away. Everett rushed inside. The room had been disturbed. Drawers were open. Photographs were scattered across the floor. But one thing was missing. Vivian's old diary. Everett stood frozen. Someone had entered the room. Someone knew they had discovered the truth. And that person had taken the one thing that might reveal everything. Then Celesty noticed something on the floor. A small piece of black fabric. She picked it up. Sir! Everett looked at it. He immediately recognized it. It belonged to someone who worked inside the mansion. Someone who had been there for years. Someone they trusted. That evening, the mansion felt different. The children stayed close to Celesty. For the first time, they weren't afraid of her leaving. They were afraid someone else might take her away. Everett sat with his children in the living room. He looked at them. Then at Celesty. He finally understood what had happened. The nanny who had arrived to take care of his children had unknowingly brought something back into his family. Hope. The triplets had spent years fighting every nanny because they were searching for the feeling their mother had given them. And Celesty had found the one thing that could reach them. Her dancing. Her patience. Her warmth. But Everett still had one question. How had Celesty learned to dance exactly like Vivian? Celesty didn't know. Until Rosalie walked over and took her hand. Dance again. Celesty smiled through her tears. You want me to? All three children nodded. Music began playing. Celesty started dancing. The triplets laughed. And for the first time in years, Everett laughed too. He watched his children spinning around Celesty and suddenly realized something. The mansion didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a family again. But then Everett noticed something on the floor. A small piece of paper had fallen from Celesty's pocket. He picked it up. There were only 6 handwritten words on it. His wife's handwriting. Everett's smile disappeared. The message said, Celesty will come back home someday. He stared at the words, then slowly looked at Celesty. She had no idea what was written on the paper. But Everett finally understood. Celesty hadn't simply walked into his mansion by chance. Someone had known she would come. Someone had been waiting for her. And somewhere inside that mansion was the person who had spent years making sure the truth about Vivian's death never came out. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss next story. Trust me, you don't want to miss any one.